to another episode of About the Authors TV UK edition. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Martin Waddell has long been a treasure within children's literature, with the BBC offering a grand review of his 6-decade career, in which he has collected many prestigious awards, including the Hans Christian Andersen Medal, considered by many to be the Nobel Prize for children's literature, and published 230 books. At last count, roughly 20 million copies have sold throughout the world, and worked their magic on young children across the globe. The Belfast Telegraph in his home country of Ireland has correctly crowned him an iconic author, where almost every home with children, it seems, has at least one Martin Waddell book, and not just in Northern Ireland. While ReadingZone.com has called him one of the most popular, talented, and respected authors of children's books writing today. The Washington Post has raved of his work, that there aren't many baby books that convey this kind of emotional richness, supported by a perfect artistic form. While PBS observed one of Waddell's most popular titles, Owl Babies, that it combined a reassuring story with stunning illustrations, while the School Library Journal took a deeper dive into why Waddell's simple and charming story, along with a wry attitude throughout, balances realism and fantasy in another popular title, Hidden House, adding up his stylistic gifts that without compromising the integrity of the story, the vocabulary is simple enough for second graders to handle. In outline, it seems like an extremely simple story, but it is handled with wit and delicacy by both the writer and the artist to create a very satisfying whole. Martin's prolific catalog features other popular titles, like In a Blue Velvet Dress, the Little Bear series, co-created with illustrator Barbara Firth over Can't You Sleep, Little Bear, Let's Go Home, Little Bear, You and Me, Little Bear, Well Done, Little Bear, and Sleep Tight, Little Bear. The Mimi Mouse trilogy over Mimi and the Dream House, Mimi and the Picnic and Mimi's Christmas, and The Park in the Dark, which took home the Kirk Mashler Award, Farmer Duck, which took home the British Illustrated Children's Book of the Year and the Nestle Smarties Book Prize. And he joins us today from his home in Ireland to talk about his decades entertaining children in literature. Martin, welcome to the show. Jumping right in, Quirkish Reviews once mused in a review of The Big Big Sea that the indefatigable Waddell shines with this tale of memory waking. He's again paired with a crackerjack illustrator. Each of his use of colored pencils conjures a feeling of conspiracy between mother and daughter. Clearly, memories are made of such stuff. Please take us back for a walk through your own memory of writing this beloved classic.
The Big Big Sea is based on the fact that I live at the foot of the mountains of Moher, and I'm looking out from my window beyond you, which you can't see, at the Big Big Sea. So as a child, my mother would take me onto the beach at night to look at the sea. And I in turn did this to my own 3 children. So that became, am I allowed to read you a book? You won't be able to see the pictures, but Mum said, let's go. So we went out of the house and into the dark, and I saw the moon. We went over the field and under the fence, and I saw the sea in the moonlight waiting for me. And I ran and Mum ran. We ran and we ran straight through the puddles and out to the sea. I went right into the shiny bit. It was only me in the Big Big Sea. I splashed and I laughed. Mum came after me. We paddled out deep in the water. We got all wet. Then we walked a bit more by the edge of the sea, and our feet made big holes in the sand. Far, far away, right round the bay, with the town and the lights in the mountains. We felt very small, Mum and me. We didn't go to the town, we just stayed for a while by the sea. And Mum said to me, remember this time, it's the way life should be. I got scolded and Mum carried me all the way back. We sat by the fire, Mum and me, and hot buttered toast, and I went to sleep on her knee. I'll always remember just Mum and me on the night that we walked by the Big Big Sea. That book actually was 7 years in the creation. And at one stage it was a part of a novel, at another stage it was a short story, and it all featured around a relative of mine who used to come to Newcastle, which we are on a seafront. There's a big wide beach. The wind blows very hard in the winter. And we live in an old house. We would hide up behind the shutters while the wind is blowing around the house. And this girl used to go out on the beach with long black hair and walk along being completely frozen and completely abused when she came back to the house. but she was bringing her daughter to the house for the first time. And I got onto the idea of a woman coming to a place that had meant something to her that wouldn't be clear to the child, but that mattered very much to her, and trying to connect the places up. And that was fine. And I did it. There's a forest behind me. A whole lot of the books come from that too. That's Bearwood. Adventures up there, various ways of focusing it. And I couldn't get the thing to focus. And I had this for 6 or 7 years, writing at it from time to time. It got as far as 7,500 words. And I was down one day on the promenade here, and a woman brought a small child down and put the small child on the promenade wall. And the child said, "Oh, Mommy, look, the big, big sea." And that gave me what I was on. That's to focus on. And then I remembered taking my own children and my own experience with my mother, and was able to tie that together. And the only remnant of what might have been a novel is the line, "It's the way life should be." That connection works for most of my books because most of them have happened here. Funny enough, the same child, the same mother, she has another child, Eva, and a wee baby called Rosie. Rosie was her daughter, and Rosie wasn't getting any attention because the mother was very concerned about her little son. And she was sitting by her bedside and nursing his son. And Rosie invented babies of her own and came and told her mother stories about the babies. And her mother, being a very intelligent woman, taped Rosie's stories and sent me Rosie's stories about her baby. And I, in turn, shaped that into a book. We actually won the Best Book for Babies award that year. The little girl who posed for the pictures and Anna's little girl were both together in Covent Garden, touching bundles of flowers. But it's lovely things like that. Stories seem to come to me, and they come to me. This is my natural place for being and working. But anytime I came to the stop of a blue file and I hadn't got any ideas, I'd just go back to the green files and open them until one of them. So when I say that Big, Big Sea took 7 years and it was partially a novel, partially a short story, that was me coming back to it again and again to see how it would work until I finally did find out how it would work. And that was this thing about look at the Big, Big Sea.
Turning the proverbial page back to your own childhood, ReadingZone.com and chronicling your fascinating start in a family of artists reported that Martin grew up amongst the woods, waterfalls, and mountains of County Down in Northern Ireland. Coming from a family of actors and writers, Waddell spent much of his time as a child in the company of storytellers. They told him tales of nonsense, of myth, of lands far away and close to home. These stories captured the imagination of the young boy and created in him a distinct sense of belonging and a powerful sense of place. Please give viewers a bit of the same, if you would, and reflecting back on your own creative childhood roots.
I'm still living where I lived as a child, so that I have my experiences as a child. I also have my experiences as a father. So those tied together. It was only in my 30s that I really realized that I was sitting on a gold mine of material. Well, I also come from a family that's done that. Both stage acting and writing. I don't know if you've heard of Helen Waddell. She reprinted 8 times in the first year of publication, or a book about theology, basically. That's where you come to go. The Helen Waddell people will kill me. I turned up in Belfast to sign copies of my thriller. And there was a pile of ladies in pearls who wanted to buy my book because I was Helen's great nephew. And there must have been more copies of my thriller sent to the bin within a week. But Helen Waddell was quite famous in her time. There was an Abbey playwright called Rutherford Maine, who was her brother. He had plays on Broadway with the Abbey Theatre Company. And a whole range, it goes back to a Victorian novelist called Captain Mayne Reid, who married my great something grandmother, I think. But there's been a whole lot of writers since. And happily, one of my sons is now a writer, although he's writing theology. So the idea of being a writer was not strange to me at all. I didn't have to break through anything about you could get your name in the book. I'd seen the family name in the book. I'd seen what the family could write.
The BBC would reveal years later, after your writing career took flight, that in fact Northern Ireland-born writer Martin Waddell's childhood dream involved a pitch in a cheering crowd. It was one shared by millions of boys down the years. Waddell wanted to be a professional footballer. He almost made it, but life had a different script in mind. Fulham Junior Club's loss was literature's gain. When the promising football career didn't work out, he turned to writing because he loved it. In the beginning, he chose to write dark comedy thrillers for adults. In 1966, his first novel, Otley, gave him almost instant celebrity. And we'd love if you take viewers back to the beginning of it all, when before gaining fame as a children's author, you experienced your first wave of it writing in fact for adults over the aforementioned debut, later made into a movie, and your next hit, Come Back Sober.
When I initially started off, I went to London to be a footballer. The idea was I'd play professional football. And I did sign for one of the big clubs and played for what would have been their academy team. We didn't have academy teams then. It was illegal to approach anybody under 17. But I got chucked out after a year, and that left me with no qualifications of any kind and living in London stuck. I also ran a junk store on a market. And one of the things I picked up from that, I got this notion that I would write. And I began to write. I worked for a publisher during the day in their sales department, but at the weekends I did this junk stall. So I had the knowledge of that sort of thing. But the people at Hutchinson, who was the publisher concerned, they didn't give me a job because of that, but I got a job with them anyway. And I was then fed a lot of stuff. It's interesting if you've shown talent, the number of people in publishing who will go out of their way to help you. I was really helped. Ethel Emdell was a ladies writer, very flowery, very overwritten. Interesting. I was given jobs like taking 100 lines out of Ethel Emdell so they could publish her in a particular paperback form. And that means lines of print. And it's very difficult to do. But I was given it by a very intelligent editor, because in doing that, I had to study how Ethel Emdell wrote. And she was hugely successful. B, she was a terrible writer. But the planning of the book was like a Jeffrey Archer novel. Everything worked. And if she mentioned a dog with a Scottish collar on page 3, it was vitally important on page 157 that you knew about this dog. So you had to cut every reference to a dog if you were taking him out and so on. But as a way of learning how writers worked, it was marvelous for me. And I got reading other people's manuscripts as well to see whether they were any good, which is, again, common practice. But it's a very good form of training if you're going to be a writer. However, having done all that, I was working away at my romantic lonely children book, and I'd been for some time. I got an agent because everybody kept saying sooner or later you will write a book. And my agent kept saying, you come in here and you laugh and you joke and you talk about what happened in the market, and then you give me these very lonely teenager wandering around the mountains in Ireland books. Can you not write me something more interesting than that? And he gave me a copy of the manuscript of the Ipcress file, Len Dayton's Ipcress file. He said, what about that? Can you do that? And I looked at Len Dayton and came back and said, I can't possibly do that because this man knows everything about the Secret Service and I know nothing. And my agent said, well, what about making a main character who knows nothing but gets involved in it? And I did. And that was the result, my first book. And that was made into a film. So that gave me the money to come home to Ireland and find a wife and begin to write, which I did. I wrote several books. And I've just written one called Come Back. These were adult thrillers. The film was Tom Courtney, people like that. Tom Courtney, Martin Waddell, people like that. Romy Schneider. But I wasn't happy with those. I didn't like them. I wanted to be writing my lonely children.
Lindenhall Library in Belfast, and marking their 230th anniversary a few years back, made the ghost in a blue velvet dress a feature of the celebration, noting importantly while doing so that Monica Cash, deputy librarian, presented Clifton House with a book with a rather unusual connection to what was then the Belfast poorhouse. Martin Waddell had asked the library to donate an inscribed copy of his children's Irish ghost story in a blue velvet dress to Clifton House. But what association does a children's book written in the 1970s have to do with Clifton House? In 1970, Mr. Waddell purchased a charming drawing of a young girl seated at a table reading a book. On the back of the portrait was a handwritten ink note identifying the subject as Rosianna Gardner, who died on the 16th of April, 1840, aged only 13 years. She'd been buried in the Gardner family plot in Clifton Street Cemetery, opened by the Belfast Charitable Society in 1797. The image of this young girl was the inspiration for Martin's book, which tells the story of a young bookworm who has to visit her aunt and uncle while her parents go on holiday. When she arrives, she realizes she's stranded with no books. A mysterious figure in a blue velvet dress appears to help her out, and this mysterious friend knows just what she needs. We'd love to hear about this transition into writing what officially mark your first book, targeted and marketed to children.
I was living in a small town called Donaghadee nearby, and writing these thrillers. I'd written Come Back When I'm Sober, and I encountered this lady in shot. Yeah. Now, I got a feeling about that girl. And about a year later, my sister-in-law, who was 12, came to visit us. And we were living in a little house by the sea, which was packed full of books. And I was busy writing Come Back When I'm Sober. And this child, who was the youngest of 8, was on her own in a house full of books. And she was a bookworm. And she kept saying, I'm just going upstairs for a wee weed. I'm going to have a wee weed. And off she went for a wee weed. It was lovely hot summer. She wouldn't go out and swim, going for a wee weed. And I connected the girl in this picture with that. And this was the birth of my first book for children, which was in the blue velvet dress. The blue velvet dress also led to a character change, because the people who liked Come Back When I'm Sober mightn't have liked Blue Velvet. Blue Velvet was a gentle, quiet, little Victorian ghost story. And a book I'm very proud of. It worked very well for me. And Come Back When I'm Sober was quite different, as you can imagine from the title. But the publishers objected at that time. So we invented a lady called Catherine Sefton. And Catherine Sefton was to do my gentle children's books, and Martin Waddell was to do my madder books. As it happened, as time went by, Martin Waddell got hold of the picture books and went slightly more deeply into psychology than Catherine Sefton ever had. So a lot of Catherine Sefton went over into being Martin Waddell later on.
Amid these early highlights of your career taking off, they were amid the far darker backdrop of the bombs and blood of the still raging at the time war between the Irish Republican Army, known as the IRA, and Northern Ireland and the British, where you yourself were in fact caught not only in the crossfire, but nearly counted as a casualty of that war, with the Belfast Telegraph reporting after the near fatality made headlines that a top Ulster author has revealed that he was unable to write for 6 years after being caught in a horrific no-warning bomb blast. Miraculously, Martin Waddell cheated death when the Loyalist device exploded just feet from where he was standing in St. Comgall's Church in Codown. The terrifying incident happened more than 30 years ago, and it ultimately brought about a dramatic change in his life. He suffered temporary deafness and body shock, and in the end, the family moved back to Martin's hometown in Newcastle. Please give viewers a sense of how this negative turned out to be a creative positive, as it led to the breakthrough of Can't You Sleep, Little Bear, which launched the wildly successful children's book series of the same title.
I had, all sorts of things happened to me along the road, but one of the things that happened to me was I went up and buried alive in a bomb incident in Ireland. They dug me out of the bomb. This was at the time of my second book, a book called The Backhouse Ghosts, which is actually a very odd book of mine, because I wrote most of it while I was in direct recovery from being blown up. And the result of that is that it's a mishmash. It isn't the way I would normally write a book. But that blew me back to the place where I'd been. I was brought up at the foot of the rock. I now live in a large house on the top of the rock. So I'm back in a very small geographical area. And the muddle of my life, both as child and adult, incidents that have happened in and around this place, translated into my books. My books nearly all come from something or other, but I first published when I was 18, and I had a big book when I was 25 that I'd written when I was 24. And I had a number of other books that were very respectable, but I was earning very little money. My wife was virtually keeping me. And I then had an overnight amazing success when in 1987. So 20 years had gone by. before I really sort of hit the jackpot's a horrible term to use, because I'd written many good books before then, but they had quite simply hadn't been hugely successful. Whereas when Can't You Sleep, Little Bear came out, I suddenly went from selling tens of thousands of books to selling literally millions of books. But again, to people who are interested in writing, the average earning of people earning a living from writing, their primary living in Britain, is £5,000 a year. And that's people who are full-time professionals. You can understand if it's a teacher who does a book or two, but these are people who are claiming that as their main income. So you're not going to make a lot of money unless something wonderful happens to you, as happened to me with Can't You Sleep, Little Bear. Well, the inspiration for that one is that I've been blown up. And as I said to you, I was really smashed by that. And the result of that was that we decided my wife would go out and work and I would look after the children, because I wasn't capable of managing properly without. So my wife kept me for about 10 years or so, during which time I'm looking after children and I'm writing quite serious books for small children, but without huge success. I did a football series, I did a detective series, various things like that. But one of the catches about it, I was beginning to write more serious books on the Northern Ireland situation and so on. So I was quite into books with a heavier subject matter. But I couldn't get doing them because I couldn't write until the children were asleep. I'd be up telling them stories. So when in Can't You Sleep, Little Bear can't sleep, he doesn't like the dark. Why don't you like the dark? The dark all around us. And it's read, this is a repetitive note right through the book. And the magic thing about that is that, as I've heard dozens of people reading that, where they read Big Bear as a very gentle, understanding father. Big Bear at that stage actually wasn't being very gentle and understanding. He was saying, would you, for God's sake, go to sleep so I can write my books? Not realizing the thing I was doing would be the seed of Can't You Sleep, Little Bear, which changed our lives entirely. But the base of that book is that Little Bear can't get to sleep. Big Bear brings in one lantern after another, bigger lantern, bigger lantern. Each time is, Can't You Sleep, Little Bear? I don't like the dark. What dark? The dark all around us. And Big Bear brings another book. Then Big Bear finally comes to the Lord when he says, come on, Little Bear, what are we going to do? We're going out into the darkness. Yes, said Big Bear. And that picture on the wall behind me there is Big Bear taking Little Bear out, and they look at the dark. I brought you the moon, Little Bear, right in the moon on between the stars. But Little Bear didn't say anything. He'd gone to sleep. That's the wind up of the book at the end. But it was born of that experience of needing to get to work, but not being able to work until they went to sleep. And it was a wonderful book. It went in about 30 editions to begin with, right around the world. Which meant my wife came back from work and our lives changed. And I did a series of books around Big Bear and Little Bear.
The American Library Association would muse at this popular series as it took off thereafter, that if Minarick and Sendak's Little Bear is the most cherished character by that name, then Martin Waddell's must clock in as a close second. Waddell, winner of the 2004 Hans Christian Andersen Medal, offers a lilting text with gently comic touches. Little Bear's housekeeping tasks include making his bed, then jumping on it. While First's expressive artwork, washed in muted tones of pebble, wood, and sky, harness the emotional undercurrents. This popular series may have particular resonance for children in single-parent households. What brought you the greatest joy personally in writing the hits that followed in the series, like Let's Go Home, Little Bear, Well Done, Little Bear, and Sleep Tight, Little Bear?
The geography of the place I'm living in, because of the woods and the mountains behind me. I did several books about that. There is, for instance, there used to be a ruin up there, which had been the dower house of the Annesley family in this area. Dower house is where you put the countess after her husband has died. That was occupied by the Americans during the war, who filled the field behind us before they were going off to the landings. And a path down beside our house. My pram used to be out beside the path, and my mother said it was filled with sweeties. The American soldiers would have come down and dropped sweeties into it. But anyway, beside that house, there's a waterfall. and the waterfall used to play through the ruin of the house. And I went up with my parents. I must be about 6 or 7 at this point. And I'm hearing the sound of the water coming through the ruin. And I told my parents there was a band in the house, and it's a ghost band. And then from then on, became terrified of the house and wouldn't go near it. And that became a book called Let's Go Home, Little Bear, which is the bear coming through the wood. But again, it echoed. And even that river, I had a son who I allowed to climb up a rocky thing with moss on it, knowing he was likely to slip. And then I dived in and saved him when he fell in the water. And that became Well Done, Little Bear, because it was a knowing thing about letting a child encounter a danger to see that it was a danger. He never did that again. So a lot of my stories are wound around that area.
Please pull the curtain back as an artist on how you managed to take a ghost story and inject it with the humor, as many have said you did brilliantly in The Backhouse Ghosts.
As The Haunting of Ellen. Because in Northern Ireland, the back house was simply that. It was little houses at the back, the remnant of horse stays. Apparently in America, back house means lavatory, I'm told. So the American edition, the Harper Row edition, was always The Haunting of Ellen. But it's a funny book because I had been blown up and I'd been buried alive in this thing. And I came out of that and really could hardly work at all and struggled very hard to complete what I called The Backhouse Ghosts. And I sent it in to Faber and Faber, one of them publishers. And almost by return of post, I got a contract and a large advance. And it was an example of how charitable publishers can be. The book really wasn't publishable, but the editor got and worked on it and kept at me and at me and at me. And we finally published it. But it's why it's not a book that I regard as satisfactory, because I was not in control of my material. It's as if I'd taken every device there ever was in Brighton and put them all into one book.
Tom Rabbit wound up in Ranker.com's top 30 best books with Rabbit in the title of all time, of which there are many. What specifically inspired you to sit down and star Tom in yours?
Tom Rabbit was based on the fact that my mother took me to a circus in the field behind our house, which is the field behind the house that I now live in. And for some reason, she had to leave the circus. She had to go home urgently about something. And she was to meet me by a particular tree after the circus. And the circus ended, and I came out, and I went and stood by the tree, and they began to take the circus down, and all the people were gone, all the lorries were gone, and still my mother didn't come. And then she eventually did come. That's that moment. And I turned that into a book called Tom Rabbit. And Tom Rabbit was read by Laura Bush, who promptly invited me over to the Easter egg roll, which was great. I went to Washington for the Easter egg roll. The only problem was when I got there, it rained torrentially and there was no Easter egg roll. And I got a free week in Washington.
Now, you and illustrator Barbara Firth have worked together over so many successful titles and series. Please describe a bit, if you would, about how this kindred connection was first established and how your back and forth worked over the years as you co-created together.
If you look again at the picture on the wall behind me, when I wrote that original text, there would have been a lot of words expressing anxiety, fearfully, cautiously, worried. If you look at the way she's drawn the bears there, you know what's going on in Little Bear's head. They're going out into the dark. He doesn't want to go. You were able to use all those words. When you're a picture book is not a thing that you own in the way that you own a novel. When I write a novel, I own everything in it. When I write a picture book, it's going to be handed to an artist. Now, I've got to get beginning, a middle, and an end, characterization, rhyme, rhythm, repetition, and a key thing which a small child will understand without having it explained to them. In that case, it's, I don't like the dark. Another would be, can I play with you? I was an only child. Can I play with you? Is a very big question. Another one is, it isn't fair. So I went around and listened to children and worked for that. And I want my mummy. I did a book called The Our Babies, which is built around I want my mummy. So I've just all that to do. And what the artist does is to give flesh, to give the furniture of the book. But when the artist does that, he changes the book because it isn't the way you saw it. I did a book called The Pig in the Pond, for instance. And I live in what is called drumlin country in Ireland. Drumlin country is where you have a succession of small hills. And the artist lives in Norfolk in England, where you have great big flat landscape. So my pictures in my head were nothing like the pictures the artist drew. But again, you have to hand over to the artist because the artist is giving depth to the characters. If you look on the mantelpiece in Can't You Sleep, Little Bear, and find various awards that Big Bear has won, various bits of his life, she's telling you about that. All I'm concentrating on is the rhyme, rhythm, etc., etc., etc. All those bits I've got to get in. The artist does a whole lot of the work. You talked before this interview, you talked a bit about Mimi. The Mimi books really were because that artist had a huge grasp of the little world. We created a complete little world. It didn't have as much of my usual drive in it. What it did have, actually, when I think about the Mimi books, they're really about Mimi has a dream house, and her various relations and friends come in, and she's trying to make plans, and each time they change something, and she changes because they've said so, and then changes back. And she keeps saying, I want a house where I can be me. And that's exactly what happens in writing of books. You have to get the house to fit you, you know.
Publishers Weekly, like so many who read it, were instantly swept away in the adventures of the stuffed animals, a monkey, an elephant, and a puppy, who make their way to the park each night after their young owner has gone to sleep. The graceful mood of the text contrasts aptly with the playful postures of the toys, who take care of each other like three siblings. The bigger one carries the smaller, and they buck up each other's courage. Firth washes her pictures with soft blues and other dusty colors, rendering each dark corner safe. These three friends make the nighttime world a welcome place. Was this a story written in reaction to your own children's fear of the park in the dark, as so many have at that young age?
I took my children to London. I just sold something. It was a big thing. We took them over an exciting time. And we went to the play park in Hampstead, three little boys, and me and their mother. And they'd never seen a tube train before. And there was a tube train that came out of the earth, as it were, up the side where they were in the play park. And the thing rumbled coming down the tunnel and then emerged. And my three small boys went, and that was the birth of Park in the Dark. Now, the interesting thing about that is there's a succession of animals in the Park in the Dark. I only gave them names, me and Loopy and Little G. The animals were out of Barbara Firth's imagination. In turn, they were toys she had played with. So in that way, she invented them. And because she invented them, her heart was in it. If I'd said one of these has to be a kangaroo, one of these has to be it wouldn't work. When I'm talking to children about it, I used to do an awful lot of talking to children on books. And said the sentence, the old woman sat in her grandmother's chair. Now, supposing my grandmother had supported Manchester United and drank a lot of Guinness, then when I'm drawing the chair, I'd have a Manchester United scarf on my old lady, and I'd have a pint of Guinness beside her. Similarly, if an artist comes to that, perhaps the artist's grandmother went to church all day and liked knitting, then you're into knitting needles and so on. It comes from the artist.
Much has been written about owl babies, the Washington Post being one, who declared that there aren't many baby books that convey this kind of emotional richness, supported by a perfect artistic form. Would you be so kind as to enlighten us as to how these adorable co-stars first began hoo-hooing in your imagination?
That's a book where I wrote a very good text. And one of the lines was, and she came, soft and silent, she swooped through the trees to Sarah and Percy and Bill, our three little lads. Now, when the artist did his picture, so powerful was that picture that you couldn't put the lines, and she came soft and silent. You just wanted, and she, because mother has come back. They've lost their mother, and mother has come back. And she came. It's like an embrace. So we had to replan the whole book. The whole book had to be taken apart and reinvented to fit that picture. That's what happens if you get a good artist. The artist who does the exciting thing of producing this picture that nobody had dreamt of. It's a wonderful picture. And it's another funny one of actually. I went to a supermarket to get some bacon, wheeled the 3 children in a pram up the street, went to get the bacon, and there was a child at the payout desk, surrounded by ladies, and very small. Oh, my mommy. Oh, my mommy. Mommy. And that was a complete gift to me. I went home, and within 2 hours, I'd written that book. Now that's, I think it's 4.5 million copies now. But simply because I encountered that child and was able to know that feeling. I worked so much with small children when I was bringing up my own children that all of that worked for me. And it's interesting, actually, one of the funny things, we have the word old, we pronounce in certain parts of Ireland as ould. Ould. So I went to one school in South Armagh and talked about the old babies, the old mammy, the old mammy. The children loved this old mammy, which was, they thought it was a rude reference. How's your old mammy?
The Library Journal were instant fans, like so many teachers and kids, of the bestseller The Pig in the Pond, applauding the way you convey a wonderful sense of silliness. The well-spaced print and the repetition make the book appropriate for beginning readers, but it certainly succeeds as a read-aloud for preschoolers. The playful language, rhythmic but not rhyme, matches the mood of the tale perfectly, and the artwork is a delight. Done with watercolor and pencil, Barton's animals are especially endearing and incredibly impressive, considering how simply they're drawn. We'd love to hear a bit about how Farmer Nelligan's pig's decision to dare to do something unusual, and Nelligan's affirmation of that decision, became story elements so many young children would relate to.
I usually don't understand the process. Words come into my head. Quite often the books come with the picture books. They came very instinctively and quickly without me knowing what they were about. I remember I was on the beach and in front of my house, and I'd been trying to do a book about animals involved in a flood who've climbed up trees and things to escape from it. Shipwreck at Nelligan's farm. And it wasn't very satisfactory, didn't like it. And I had a row with my editor. My editor, a guy called David Lloyd, an ex-circus clown, but he's been responsible for some of the most wonderful books in picture books of the century. He got very cross with me and he went off to paddle, rolled up his trousers, went off and paddled. And I sat there smoking a pipe and puffing and feeling very cross. And a woman came down and plumped a small baby into a puddle of water. And the baby sat on the water and went with the sheer joy of the coolness. And the words I got were the pigs in the pond. And that night, within about 3 hours, I wrote The Pigs in the Pond. And it again went, that's the one that had the flat countryside. But I mean, that took 3 hours. The owl babies, probably about 2 hours. The big sea, more than 7 years. It seems to go different. I had a system of working where I had green files, which were things I thought there was something in, and blue files, which were the ones I was actually working on. So I was making a living from this and working seriously at it and enjoying it hugely.
Outside of those inspired from your own, children's authors talk so often about drawing their inspiration for a new story from real-life moments they witness in public between parents and their kids. We understand Farmer Duck offers a pretty funny illustration of that art-imitating life process in action.
Farmer Duck, That's It Isn't Fair. There's a child in a playground stamping her foot, going, it isn't fair, it isn't fair. And I got it from that. It was as simple as that. It was written several times to get it right. Obviously, it bears some relation to George Orwell, but he's not getting my share of the royalties. And the only thing about that was the beauty of the illustration of that one. If you look at what Helen Oxenbury's done with that, funnily enough, the inner pages, I forget the name for them, the pages at the beginning and end of the book, the season changes. wee touches like that Helen does so marvelously. She did an awful lot of drawings, some of which I've got actually.
Creating on another canvas entirely, it was a reaction to your own children to the ongoing IRA wars of the 1980s in Belfast that inspired you to write a far more grown-up and subject matter Troubles trilogy to try to help explain it to them over Starry Night, Frankie's Story, and The Beat of the Drum, if you'd care to share.
Later on, I began to write much more complicated books, novels, about the Northern Ireland problem, because I found my own children were encountering it. We had one day when one of my children was standing at the window, I think, sure he'd have been about 8 or 9. He said, something's happened down the road, there's a lot of policemen. And what had happened down the road was that a policeman who crossed the road in plain clothes, I think, and somebody came up behind him and blew his head off. And I thought I've got to be able to talk about that. And I wrote a trilogy of books around that, but that again was to do. I didn't write it at the time my children were growing. My children had already grown, but it was written to explain that to children of that age, because I see plainly this little boy didn't understand why that would happen. So he now writes his own books.
How thrilling and we'd imagine fulfilling was it to carry on the tradition of writing your very own Irish folk and fairy tales over the years?
The traditional ones don't interest me very much, but I wrote a number of my own. One, for instance, called Himself. Now, Himself is a man who lives with his brother, and he's a farmer, and the two of them are on this wee patch of land. And he talks to himself from time to time, talks about himself. And then he takes a notion of the girl, and he has to present himself to the girl. And there's a whole business about presenting himself to the girl. And by the end of the book, we find that she's doing the same thing. She's got herself, and the four of them come together. So it's a funny sort of Irish folktale, if you like. I've done a few traditional ones, but not to any great extent. Although my introduction to story was of traditional stories. In Irish mythology, the red-headed man is a figure who is held to be halfway to the other world, to have connection with things. And in my life, there was an actor called Terence Pym who came to the house and told me fairy stories. But he set my fairy stories where I've now set my stories, in a version of Newcastle and County Down where I live. So that they were immediate. When he talked about a waterfall, I knew what waterfall he was discussing. I know what it looked like. And Terence was quite a magic person for me. He was an actor who didn't make it, a very odd man. I think there was a thing about the Waddell name on the books, but then that also meant I had the Waddell place in the books. When used to that idea that you could do your own stories, and the Terence's made up things were magic to me.
Now, you won the Hans Christian Andersen Medal, which the BBC noted is considered by many to be the Nobel Prize for children's literature, and marks an acknowledgement of the impact you've had on millions of young readers' lives. Where have you drawn your greatest joy amid all that reaction to your one-of-a-kind way with words?
I've just been so incredibly lucky. I mean, the thing, that's what when we started off, we talked about how do you write? You don't write unless you really love it. I was writing for years before I sold anything at all, and writing for years more before anybody took any notice of what I was doing. But I never had a doubt about that. I was lucky in that I had a very trusting and faithful wife who helped to keep bread on the table during that period, and most people don't have that. So first thing you should have if you're going to be a writer is to marry somebody who looked after you, which I did. It's the joy of doing it. And one of the things that gets me now is that I've really lost that. I've begun to paint because I don't pick up the messages. Somebody says I want my mommy and I don't get a 4 million copy.
Finally, as a storyteller, what are a few golden bits of guidance you could send the aspiring writer down the road with before we go?
if you're going to be a writer, you have to really love doing it. It's fun. It's not. It doesn't feel like work. I'm very lucky. I've spent most of my life simply writing. When people say, how do you begin? How you begin is you get a typewriter and you start to type, you start to do it. And if you don't love it, there's no point in going on. I think this is the other thing. People always talk as if there was a set of tricks that you learned. You do not learn a set of tricks. You learn some techniques, but what you're trying to do is not do what other people have done. You're trying to create your own world, your own ways. And I do feel that I succeeded in doing that to the limit of my ability. That's one of the other things I've left out. If you are writing for children, one of the important things to remember is fun. There must be, it's the one biggest thing that I read nearly all of Enid Blyton when I was a child, and the great big thing about her was that something happened on every page. Fun, 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 fun. And I've written lots of daft books, lots of really stupid books, but books that had some reason behind them, if only the very simple reason, which has been very important to me, and a lot of my folk tales were in that area, that if you can write very simple books where the words used are very simple and very few, but they do convey a story and they are coherent. And that means a child who has difficulty reading will be able to go along and have read a book. I've written a number of books that were really written just so somebody could read. And that in itself it's away from the idea of I will write a beautiful book, but it has a beauty of its own, which is its clarity and its simplicity. I've done a lot of books like that.
Martin, it's been wonderful talking today. Thank you so much for taking our time to be on About the Authors TV.